Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on how the show works. Here on the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Our Commander's Quarters decks are built on a $25 budget, that's $25 for 100 cards. But before we get started on today's episode, why don't you go and hit that subscribe button to make sure that you can stay up to date on the latest Commander's Quarters deck techs. Today's commander is going to be Goreclaw, Terra of Qal Sisma. She's a 4/3 bear that costs 3 and a green and has creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. Also, whenever Goreclaw attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until the end of the turn. Now there are a ton of tribal decks in Commander, and this is going to be a very unique one. This tribal deck is going to be a Power Matters tribal deck. So each and every single non-mana dork in this deck is going to have power 4 or greater. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we want to get our commander out quickly so that we can reduce the cost of our creatures. Green has some of the most efficiently costed creatures in Magic, so we can get some really big creatures out for not a lot of mana in this deck. How are we going to win with this deck? Well, we're just going to smash some face. We're going to demolish our opponents with a horde of giant beaters. We're going to flood the board with giant beaters before our opponents even have a chance to blink. And then Goreclaw's second ability is going to trigger when she attacks, and all of our creatures are going to get +1/+1 and trample. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. Let's go into tactic number 1, Bear Trackers. Now again, the first piece of our strategy is to get Goreclaw out quickly. These mana dorks might not synergize with Goreclaw's ability specifically, but they do synergize with other parts of the deck. First up, there's Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves, each of which tap for a green. Since we're in a mono green deck, Arbor Elf pretty much does the exact same thing by untapping a forest for us. Beastcaller Savant has haste, it can tap for 1 mana of any color, but we can only spend this mana to cast creature spells. Luckily for us, the majority of our spells are creature spells. Then there's Heart Warden, which taps to add green mana, or we can pay 2 to sacrifice it and draw a card, which can help us later in the game. Drover the Mighty can tap to add 1 mana of any color, and we are running a few dinosaurs in this deck, so he can get +2/+2 when they're in play. Next up is Werebear, who taps for a green, and when we have Threshold, he gets +3/+3. Then there's Vine Trellis, which is a 0/4 defender that can tap for a green. Overgrown Battlement is the exact same, but it can tap to add green for each defender that we control. Next up is Ulvenwald Captive, which is a 1/2 defender that can tap to add green to our mana pool. We can also pay 5 green to transform him into a 4/6 that taps for 2 colorless. Then there's Scorn Villager, which taps for a green, and at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, we get to transform her. She transforms into a 2/2 with Vigilance that can tap for 2 green. Then there's Whisper of the Wilds, which can tap for a green, and if we have Ferocious, it can tap for 2 green. Finally, there's Sakura Tribe Elder, which we can sacrifice to search our library for a basic land card and put into play tapped. Getting our commander out a turn early is huge for this deck, since she provides so much value when she's in play. Let's go through some of those creatures that she's going to help us cast in tactic number 2, Quick Beats. Mir Superion is a 5/6 that is completely free for us to cast with Goreclaw in play. And these next 5 creatures are only going to cost us 2 mana with her on the battlefield. When Bristling Hydra enters the battlefield, we get 3 energy. We can use that 3 energy whenever we want to put a +1/+1 counter on it and give it hexproof until the end of the turn. When Hunted Troll enters the battlefield, we're going to have to give one of our opponents 4 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying. But since he's an 8/4 that can regenerate just for a green, it's a good exchange for us. Then there's Sirach the Huntcaller, which is a 5/4 that has Formidable. At the beginning of combat on our turn, if creatures we control have a total power of 8 or greater, we can give one of our creatures haste until the end of the turn. Next up is Territorial Allosaurus, which we can kick for 2 and a green, and if we do kick it, when it enters the battlefield, we get to make it fight target creature. Finally, there's Pelucranos World Eater, which is a 5/5 that has Monstrosity X. By paying XX green, we can make it monstrous, and it's going to deal X damage divided as we choose among any number of target creatures our opponents control, and each of those creatures is going to deal damage equal to its power to Pelucranos. We can get out all of these creatures very quickly with Goreclaw in place, and she reduces the cost. But there are other ways in our deck that help us reduce the mana costs as well. Let's go through some of them now in tactic number 3, Cast Along Shadow. Emerald Medallion is an artifact that's going to make our green spells cost 1 less to cast. Then there's Ronus' Monument, which has green creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample until the end of the turn. Conduit of Ruin is a 5/5, and when we cast it, we can search our library for a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater, reveal it, and then shuffle our library and put that card on top of it. But the main reason that he's in this deck is that the first creature spell we cast each turn is going to cost 2 less to cast with him in play. Next up is Yeva Nature's Herald, which doesn't reduce the cost of any of our cards, but it is going to come in huge for this deck. She's a 4/4 with flash and gives all of our other green creature spells flash as well. Then there's Garruk's Horde, which is a 7/7 trampler that's going to let us play with the top card of our library revealed. If that top card of our library is a creature card, we can cast it. All of these cards provide us with a huge amount of value when it comes to casting our creatures. But we need to make sure that we draw into some of those creatures in order to cast them. So let's go into tactic number 4, One Hit Wonder. When Nessian Game Warden enters the battlefield, we get to look at the top X cards of our library, where X is the number of force that we control. We can then reveal a creature card from among them and put it into our hand and put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. The later the game goes, the more value this guy is going to provide to us. Then we're running Mouth and Feed. Mouth is going to give us a 3/3 hippo, but the main thing that we care about is that Feed side. Feed has Aftermath, so we can cast it from our graveyard, and when we do, we're going to get to draw a card for each creature we control with power 3 or greater. Next up is Shamanic Revelation, which is going to let us draw a card for each creature we control, and we gain 4 life for each creature we control with power 4 or greater. This card comes in huge for this deck. Not only will it draw us a ton of cards, but it's going to gain us a lot of life. Then there's Regal Force, which when it comes into play, we get to draw a card for each green creature we control. Nearly every single creature in this deck is green, so we're going to be drawing a ton of cards with this guy. Finally, there's Sandstone Oracle, which is one of those few cards that's not a green creature. Sandstone Oracle is a 4/4 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, we get to choose an opponent, and if that player has more cards in hand than us, we get to draw cards equal to the difference. This card comes in huge to help us refill our hand and keep us going. Now these cards are great at helping us draw cards, but their effect only happens once. Let's go through some more consistent ways in tactic number 5, a huge draw. Triumph of Ferocity is an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card if you control the creature with the greatest power or tied for the greatest power. And the vast majority of the time, we are going to have that creature with the greatest power. Then there's Colossal Majesty, which is similar but it has a lesser restriction. It has at the beginning of our upkeep, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, we get to draw a card. Next up is Entourage of Trest, and when it comes into play, we become the Monarch, and it can block an additional creature each combat as long as we are the Monarch. When we're the Monarch, we get to draw an additional card during our end step, but if someone takes that away from us by dealing combat damage to us, it's not too hard for this deck to hit them right back. Then there's Garruk's Pack Leader, which has whenever another creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. Elemental Bond does the exact same thing, but it's on an enchantment. And then there's Kavu Lair, which is very similar, and it has whenever a creature with power 4 or greater comes into play, its controller draws a card. Some of our opponents may benefit a little bit off of this card, but we're going to draw a ton of cards with it in play. Next up is Primordial Sage, which has whenever you cast a creature spell, you may draw a card. Soul of the Harvest is very similar. It has whenever another non-token creature you control enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. For this deck, with either of these guys in play, we're going to be drawing a ton of cards. Finally, there's Ulvenwald Observer, which has whenever a creature you control with toughness 4 or greater dies, draw a card. So if we have this guy in play and somebody wraths the board, we get to draw a lot of cards to help us rebuild. So just what are some of those cards that we want to draw into? Let's go on to tactic number 6, Nature Provides. Rampaging Baloth is a 6/6 with Trample and Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we can create a 4/4 green beast creature token. So in this deck, not only are we getting a 6/6 Trampler for only 4 mana, but also we are getting a huge benefit with those extra beast tokens coming into play. And since those beast tokens are 4/4s, whenever we attack with Goreclaw, those beast tokens are going to get +1/+1 in Trample until the end of the turn. Then there's Loyal Guardian, which is a 4/4 Trampler with Lieutenant. At the beginning of combat on our turn, if we control our commander, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. This guy can come in huge for this deck, even making our mana dorks into threats. Next up is Verdant Sun's Avatar, which has whenever Verdant Sun's Avatar or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. With all the huge creatures in this deck, we're going to be gaining a ton of life with this guy in play. Finally, there's Paleoloth, which has whenever another creature with power 5 or greater comes into play under your control, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This guy can come in huge by bringing us back some of our best creatures in the deck. Speaking of bringing creatures back, let's talk about bringing creatures back in a different way. Let's go on to tactic number 7, There and Back Again. We're running a lot of creatures in this deck that have some really good enter the battlefield effects. Being able to cast those creatures more than once can provide us with some huge value. Stampeding Wildebeest and Stampeding Sarrow are basically the exact same card. They are both 5/4s with Trample that have, at the beginning of your upkeep, return a green creature you control to its owner's hand. And then Roaring Primadox is pretty similar. It's a 4/4 that has, at the beginning of your upkeep, return a creature you control to its owner's hand. Again, by being able to bounce creatures back to our hand at the beginning of our upkeep, we can recast those that have really good enter the battlefield triggers. One of the best enter the battlefield effects in the deck comes on Fierce Empath, which is a 1/1 that has, when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost 6 or greater, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. We are running plenty of creatures in this deck that have a converted mana cost of 6 or greater, so this guy can help us get some of our best cards. Indrik Stomphowler and Conclave Naturalist are basically the exact same card. When they enter the battlefield, we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Then there's Wickerbow Elder, which comes into play with a -1/-1 counter on it, and we can pay a green to remove that counter to destroy target artifact or enchantment. These guys come in huge for us by destroying any pesky artifacts and enchantments that our opponents have. Next up is Thicket Elemental, which is a 4/4 and has a kicker of 1 green. When Thicket Elemental enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, we can reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal a creature card. If we do, we put that card onto the battlefield and then shuffle all other cards revealed this way into our library. We are running a ton of huge creatures in this deck, and this guy can help us get one out for free. Then there's Ridge Scale Tusker, and when it comes into the battlefield, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature we control. Finally, there's Great Oak Guardian, which has flash and reach, and when it comes into the battlefield, creatures target player controls get +2/+2 until the end of the turn, and they untap them. We can use this guy in a variety of ways. We can pump our team while they're attacking, and we can untap them. We can use it defensively, so we can pump our team and then block with our untapped creatures. Or we can target another player and untap all of their creatures and give them +2/+2 to help them block. There are some cards in this deck that have some truly amazing enter the battlefield effects, and being able to get those effects multiple times is huge. While we're doing this though, we really want to make sure that we're keeping our creatures alive, especially Goreclaw. So let's go on to tactic number 8, Protect the Pack. Temur Sabertooth is a 4/3 that has pay 1 and a green. You may return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Temur Sabertooth gains indestructible until the end of the turn. This card is great at protecting some of our best assets. For just the price of 1 and a green, at any time we can return another creature back to our hand. And on top of that, Temur Sabertooth gets indestructible so it can stay on the battlefield in most situations. Speaking of indestructible, let's go on to the golden pig of this deck. Soul of New Phyrexia is a 6/6 avatar with trample that costs 6. It has pay 5, permanents you control gain indestructible until the end of the turn. We can even pay 5 to exile it from our graveyard and get the same effect. This card comes in huge for this deck, and it's very hard for our opponents to work around if we have 5 mana available. With 5 mana up, our opponents are going to be very hesitant to cast a board wipe with this guy in play. Because if they do, all that's going to happen is our guys are going to stay on the board and everyone else's creatures are going to be gone. Even if they somehow get lucky and kill this guy, we can still exile him from our graveyard to give all of our permanents indestructible for just 5 mana. This deck depends on having big creatures in play so we can keep attacking and keeping the pressure on our opponents. And Soul of New Phyrexia is our best way to keep those creatures on the battlefield where they belong. This is a fantastic card in this deck and definitely deserves the title of the Golden Pig. Another fantastic card in this deck is Vigor. It's a 6/6 with trample and has, if damage would be dealt to another creature you control, prevent that damage and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented this way. And if Vigor's put into a graveyard from anywhere, we just get to shuffle it into our library. This card is amazing in this deck and it just lets us attack freely with all of our other creatures. We actually want our opponents to block us because if they do, our creatures get bigger. Now let's talk about some of those big creatures in tactic number 9, big boys. Verdurous Gearhulk is a 4/4 with trample, and when it enters the battlefield, we get to distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures we control. With our commander in play, this guy is an insane 8 power for 3 mana. But then there's Wolfear Silverheart, which is even more insane. It's a 4/4 with Soul Bond, and as long as it's paired with another creature, each of those creatures get +4/+4. So for just 3 mana, we're getting a total of 12 power. Speaking of 12 power for 3 mana, there's Outland Colossus. It's a 6/6 with Renown 6, which means that when it deals combat damage to a player, if it isn't renowned, we get to put 6 +1/+1 counters on it and becomes renowned. It also can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. And with Goreclaw in play, attacking, it's going to get +1/+1 and trample to help us get through with him. By pretty much immediately becoming a 12/12, this guy is a huge beater in this deck. Finally, there's perhaps our biggest beater in the deck, and that's Hydra Omnivore. Hydra Omnivore is an 8/8, but it has, whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to each other opponent. Usually the problem in most decks with Hydra Omnivore is that people can chump block it since it doesn't have trample. But when our commander attacks, this guy's going to get +1/+1 and trample so he can get through. Speaking of helping us get combat damage in, let's go on to tactic number 10, Coming Through. Bellowing Tangleworm is a 4/4 that has Intimidate, but it's also going to give all of our other green creatures Intimidate. So our opponents that don't have a green creature or an artifact creature won't be able to block the majority of our creatures. Next up is Thunderfoot Baloth, which is a 5/5 with trample and lieutenant. As long as we control our commander, Thunderfoot Baloth is going to get +2/+2, and other creatures we control get +2/+2 and trample. So as long as we have Goreclaw in play, our team is going to get huge. Then there's Overwhelming Stampede, which is a sorcery that has, until the end of the turn, creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. This card is a great finisher in this deck and even makes our mana dorks into huge threats. Finally, there's Dragon Throne of Tarkir, which is an equipment that costs 4 mana and costs 3 to equip. It's going to give the equipped creature Defender and 2 tap. Other creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X until the end of the turn, where X is this creature's power. By throwing this on one of our biggest creatures, we can make our entire team huge each turn by only paying 2. This deck is very explosive and can overwhelm our opponents very quickly. Goreclaw does an amazing job of not only helping us cast our big creatures, but also pumping them to help them get their damage through. But now that we've gone through every single card in this deck that helps us win, let's go through the cards that help make it work. Let's go on to the mana base. We're going to be running 36 lands in this deck, including Rogue's Passage. Rogue's Passage either taps for a colorless, or we can pay 4 and tap it to make target creature unblockable until the end of the turn. This can come in handy when we want to make sure that we get a creature through in combat. Next up is Oran Wreath the Vastwood, which comes into play tapped and taps for a green, but it can also tap to put a +1/+1 counter on each green creature that entered the battlefield this turn. Nearly all the creatures in this deck are green, so this card comes in huge. Then there's Mosswort Bridge, which is a hideaway land. So it's going to enter the battlefield tapped, and when it does, we get to look at the top 4 cards of our library, exile one of them face down, and then put the rest on the bottom of our library. It can tap for green, or we can pay a green and tap it to play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if creatures we control have a total power of 10 or greater. Finally, we've got the basic forest, and there will be 33 of those in this deck. Now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. As always, our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damage cards because those cards need a home too. The average Goreclaw EDHREC deck is going to set you back $90.14. Let's see how we compare to that. Our deck is much more affordable, coming in at $24.82. All Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within that $25 budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. Let's look at what some of those ways just might be in our reasonable upgrades. Archetype of Endurance comes in at $1.99. It's a 6/5 that says, creatures you control have hexproof, creatures your opponents control lose hexproof and can't have or gain hexproof. This is overall just a really good card to help us protect our team. Then there's Heroic Intervention, which comes in at $5.49. Heroic Intervention is an instant that says, permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn. For a very low cost of 2 mana, this is a fantastic card to help us save our board during a wrath. Then there's Nylea, God of the Hunt, coming in at $6.56. She's a 6/6 indestructible god that has, as long as your devotion to green is less than 5, Nylea isn't a creature. Other creatures you control have trample, and pay 3 in a green, target creature gets +2/+2 until the end of the turn. Nylea is just a fantastic beater in this deck, pretty much just a 6/6 indestructible for 2, and she can pump a creature. Next up is Bramble Sovereign, which comes in at $8.25. It's a 4/4 that has, whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield, you may pay 1 in a green. If you do, that creature's controller creates a token that's a copy of that creature. We have a ton of huge creatures in this deck, and a lot that have great enter the battlefield effects, so creating a token copy of them is huge. Then there's Ripjaw Raptor coming in at $2.78. Ripjaw Raptor is a 4/5 that has Enrage. Whenever Ripjaw Raptor is dealt damage, draw a card. This card's just a fantastic value in this deck. It's basically a 4/5 for 2 mana, and whenever it's dealt damage, we get to draw cards. Finally, there's Galta Primal Hunger, which comes in at $8.99. Galta is a 12/12 with trample, and it has Galta Primal Hunger costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control. With the amount of power that we pump out in this deck quickly, Galta's pretty much just going to cost us green. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really want to hear what you guys think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. Also, make sure you're following us on both Twitter and Facebook so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. The links to our Twitter and Facebook can be found in the description below. Also in the description below, you'll find a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron of the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a new general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and check out some of our other deck techs. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.